Good God.
Oh, one.
Oh, Ali.
Yeah, channel one. Yeah. Okay, is that better? I think that's beginning to work, isn't it?
So I've got my microphone.
You're off, are you?
God, you're frozen.
It's a bit chilly out there.
Just a bit. Oh, God. I'm so bloody nervous.
You'll be all right. You have it too loud. It's more for the signal for the recording than anything.
God, I've got double vision now. I say I've got double vision. I can't.
Slow down. No problem.
Yeah, so please put it on mute if you want to at the moment. And I'll say, gentlemen, green, go green. Owen knows all about this. He goes.
How do I go green here?
So you go. I think you just push.
Just gone live.
And you need to go through.
Right, well, good evening to everybody. On my clock, on my watch, it's 32 minutes past. On that one, it's 29, but I think on average it's half past. So welcome to everyone on a very, very cold night and a difficult topic. So thank you all for coming, and we have a great speaker to help us understand it. So I should just say, my name's Owen Bennett-Jones. I'm sitting in for David Griffiths, who doesn't feel too good tonight, so he asked me if I could cover this. And as I've sat here, I've got more and more announcements given to me to make. So the first one is that the Samaritans very decently have turned up with a box. And the idea is obviously that it gets filled. So I will put that there in a prominent position that everyone can see. And David asked them, invited, I think, John Davison to come. So thank you very much to John for coming. I also have the Christmas concert at St Bailog, Llanfaelog, tomorrow, 7:30. Very reasonable tickets, £5. That's Friday at 7:30 tomorrow. And then I should also say this is recorded, and if there's any anxiety about that, I'm assured we can edit. So if anyone afterwards feels that they said something they didn't mean or didn't want to say, or would rather not be put on the internet, then we can simply excise that remark. So don't worry about that, but do come to us afterwards if you would like that recording to be changed in any way. And I also want to welcome 3 nurses from Penrose Stanley, who David invited, and you're very welcome. I don't think you've been before, but you're very, very welcome here this evening, and thank you very much for coming. So, welcome to John Lewis, who many of you will know, and I should just say a bit about his career. He was trained at Charing Cross Hospital in London, 45 years as a GP, and I've heard, as I'm sure you will have heard, he was a much respected and much loved GP in his community, and had an awful lot of support from his patients there over the years. And he's been in Rhosneigr since 2013, and after being a GP, he took on 18 months at the hospice at Penrose Stanley. So that obviously qualifies him to talk about this difficult topic that we all probably should think about and probably try not to. So he can take it head on, and we'll hear Dr. John Lewis for 15 minutes, 20 minutes or something like that, and then throw it open to questions, and everyone's welcome to either ask a question or make a contribution. So, John, over to you.
Hi, Owen, thank you so much for your kind words of introduction. I apologize to you all for talking about death 10 days from the most famous birthday. I'm anxious about speaking in public, so I hope you'll forgive me if I read from my notes. Historical writings indicate that the idea of death and the fear of death haunts the human like nothing else. It is the mainspring of human activity whose function is to avoid the fatality of death by denying it in its final destiny. Let me read to you some words written by the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived between 341 and 270 BC. Death does not concern us because as long as we exist, death is not here. When death comes, we no longer exist. All sensation and consciousness ends with death, and therefore in death there is neither pleasure nor pain. The fear of death arises from the belief that in death there is awareness, and in those days there was no illusion of afterlife. We then move on to St. John the Evangelist, AD 6 to query 100 AD. I think he lived a good 90 years, which is astounding. But he wrote, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." Turn the page. We moved from St. John the Evangelist to something called the Ars Moriendi, which was written in AD 1415, so it's quite a lapse of time there. The art of dying well, according to the Christian precepts of the late Middle Ages, and they were influenced by the horrors of the Black Death, which had occurred. It was translated into many European languages and was the first treatise on death and dying. It was published as a series of woodcut pictures, as images could be easily explained and memorized. It contained chapters which encompassed the things we try to do today in palliative care, including the involvement of friends and family at the deathbed, with appropriate prayers to be said at this time. I now move to a lighter approach to this evening's topic and wish to mention the Victorians' obsession with death. Obsession with death was by Her late Majesty Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901. She is reported to have mourned the death of her husband, Prince Albert, by dressing in black every day and keeping the home exactly as it was on the day of his death. Every morning, servants would set out Prince Albert's coffee mug. The glass from which he took his last dose of medicine remained by the bedside for 4 decades. The anthropologist Hocart, and his dates were 1883 to 1939, studied South Pacific societies in depth. He declared that primitives were not bothered by death or the fear of death, and that there was anthropological evidence that death was often associated with rejoicing and celebration rather than fear, similar in a way to the traditional Irish wake. Death was thought to be the ultimate promotion to a higher form of life, a form of eternity. Modern Westerners have trouble believing this anymore, and this makes the fear of death universal, a prominent part of our psychological makeup. A person may say that he knows that he will die someday, but that they do not really care, as they are having a good time with living and do not think about death. Fear is thus repressed. Let me define death for you, and you wish to do this a little later in my talk. I define death as the cessation of biochemical processes of life in a tissue or cell that cannot be reversed. In my experience, there are 2 types of death: sudden death and anticipated death. Sudden death, as in a heart attack, serious stroke, or, as we've heard on the news this week, drowning, is hopefully amenable to cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR, with or without the added use of an automated external defibrillator referred to as an AED, the awareness of which and the availability of which is increasing, particularly since the use of an AED to successfully resuscitate the Danish footballer Christian Eriksen. He had a cardiac arrest while being televised playing for Denmark. He survived and continues to play football. For your information, the nearest AED devices for Rhosneigr residents are on the side wall of the village hall, the side facing the library, also in the front of the fire station, in the golf course, just outside the door here, and also at Lanveilog Surgery. The use of an AED and advice on CPR is well covered on the web, and when you use an AED device, it talks you through the process, as long as you can speak American. If resuscitation is successful, then my definition defined earlier, the cessation of biochemical processes of life in a tissue or cell that cannot be reversed, this questions the validity of the diagnosis of sudden death. At the time of resuscitation, the patient is unconscious. After successful resuscitation, patients were asked what, if anything, they could remember about the event, remembering they were unconscious at the time. 140 survivors were questioned in one cohort, and 25% said that they were aware that they felt that events were either speeding up or slowing down. 20% felt a sense of peace and pleasantness. 13% said that their senses felt more vivid than usual, and 13% said that they felt separated from their bodies. Some reported seeing family members, having déjà vu experiences, seeing golden lights, and aware of a sensation of being dragged through water. We should not assume that because a patient may be in cardiac arrest and look to be dead, that they have no awareness. Death is not, therefore, a finite moment, and we have the potential to resuscitate at all times. There are long-term impacts of people who are resuscitated, and this leads to fatigue, particularly in children who have drowned, and it's a consequence of oxygen deprivation to important organs. In February of this year, an elderly gentleman was having an EEG, that's an electrical recording of the brain, as part of an investigation into newly diagnosed epilepsy. During this investigation, he had a heart attack and died. Scientists were able to record the brain activity, and for 30 seconds either side of his death, they detected an increase in brain waves known as gamma oscillations. Now, these brain waves are also associated with memory retrieval and dreaming. It is reported that the brain is capable of coordinated activity for a short period after death. By generating oscillations involved in memory retrieval, the brain may be recalling important life events just before we die, similar to the events reported in near-death experiences. These findings challenge our understanding of when exactly life ends. This isolated finding led to further studies and the measurement of brain activity during CPR. This suggests that the human sense of consciousness may not cease completely at the time of death. After successful resuscitation, the cohort of patients were interviewed, and many recall lucid experiences during the procedure, observing events without pain or distress, and having a meaningful evaluation of life. Similar brainwaves have been recorded in rats, and I believe, Mark, where's Mark?
Yes, I'm here.
Also in mollusks. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
I used to keep snails' brains alive for maybe 2 weeks and record electrical activity from them. Yes.
Thank you. I can't correlate snail brains and human brains, but I'm sure. This leads me actually to a topic that I do feel more qualified to talk about, and that is anticipated death. This may follow an extended worsening frailty in an elderly patient or a pronouncement of a terminal illness where palliative care is needed. I'm happy to report that palliative care as a speciality is now well established in medicine and also helped by the hospice movement. We are very fortunate to have a new hospice at Penrose Stanley Hospital, Holyhead, and this is a satellite unit to St David's Hospice at Llandudno and fulfills an essential requirement on Anglesey. And it can help in 3 fronts. It provides symptom control for terminally ill patients, can help with pain, control nausea, vomiting, fatigue, breathlessness. All these symptoms can be helped, and with appropriate medication, improve the quality of life. Help may be offered also by respite care, giving distraught and fatigued relatives and carers a chance to recharge their batteries. Help can also be offered with respect to end-of-life care. It can often be a difficult conversation, but discussion about completing a will, involving the service of those authorized to be attorneys, arranging a meeting with the convener of your faith, discussing funeral arrangements. These are difficult discussions, but they do offer considerable help and mental relaxation to both the patient and the families involved. If you review the obituaries in the local newspaper, deaths are always reported as sudden or peaceful. Everyone tries to postpone difficult questions on death until they are forced to face them. We all try to avoid the issue until we conceive the context of our own imminent death. On receiving a terminal diagnosis, we all go through a similar series of emotions described so well in a book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I'll mention that later. There's a series of things that we go through. Firstly, there's denial. No, it's not true. Can't be me. Then anger. Why me? And this is followed by bargaining. If I ask God nicely, perhaps things will change. Then, with advancing disease, there is depression, and we must not forget the grief a terminally ill patient has to go through. This leads to acceptance, where the aforementioned phase of acceptance is reached, where the coming and is met by quiet expectation. Finally, there is a phase of hope. I've mentioned the phase defense mechanisms, and the one thing that persists through all these is hope, the possibility of a cure, a wonder drug, or a last-minute revelation from a research product. Hope is a rationalization for their suffering, a form of temporary but needed denial. Many of you will have heard of Dignitas in Switzerland. This is a legal non-profit organization whose mantra states that one should live with dignity and be able to die with dignity. It offers physician-supported assisted death. And when I was reading about this, I did not know, but apparently those who accompany their loved ones to Dignitas and who are present at the time of assisted death are liable to prosecution up to 14 years in prison on returning to the UK. This is clearly unacceptable. And Baroness Meacher, Chair of Dignity in Dying, has initiated an assisting dying bill in the House of Lords. This has already exceeded the basic requirement of 100,000 signatures and is awaiting debate in the House of Commons. And I read in the papers last week that this will be beginning of next year. The bill is intended for terminally ill and competent adults, and dying people who wish to control the manner and time of their death should not be considered suicidal. Thoughts along these lines apply, aptly labeled as locked-in syndrome. A related case of this, fortunately very rare syndrome. In 2005, a person had a massive stroke. He remained conscious, but totally paralyzed and unable to speak, and was only able to communicate by blinking. Application was made to the High Court to allow doctors to end his life, but this was refused. Sadly, but perhaps happily for him, he died in 2012. Situations arrive when the inevitability of death is met with attempted compensation, and I came across this in the hospice quite often. Statements like, I am going to meet, and they mention the name of a loved one. And this is a fact crystallized by the verses of Until We Meet Again. I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but I'll remind you. Those special memories of you will always bring a smile. If only I could have you back for just a little while, then we could sit and talk again, just like we used to do. You always meant so very much, and always will, too. The fact you are no longer here will always cause me pain, but you are forever in my heart until we meet again. Now, I mentioned earlier a little bit about bibliography, and there are 3 books I would like to mention. One is called On Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. There's another excellent book called The Denial of Death by Professor Ernest Becker, and another excellent book, Advice on Dying by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, all these are available in paperback form. They're all available in a paperback form from a firm named after a South American river, and I do not believe I'm allowed to advertise. I have left the most important part of this talk to the end, and I know, having discussed it with him, that the Reverend Vince Morris should be the person to enlighten us on eternal life and life everlasting. The soul of a dead person enters a sleeping state that continues until the last judgment, when the resurrection will either assign either eternal life or eternal damnation. If I have touched upon anything that may have distressed you or worried you, please do not hesitate to discuss this with me later. Man has not changed, and death remains a fearful happening. The fear of death is a universal fear. What has changed is our way of coping with death and dying. I would like to thank David, Bobby, Mark, and Owen for their support, help, and encouragement in what at times has been a difficult subject. I will conclude with 2 extracts from the writings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. If you accept that death is a part of life, then when it comes, you may face it more easily. And also, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Thank you.
Handled talk on a very sensitive topic. So we're going to discuss it. We've got an hour or so to do that. And just as people are thinking of what they want to ask you or what contributions they want to make, I can see that you felt quite strongly about Dignitas and the people who come back from there facing prosecution.
What I don't know, and whether that has actually happened, I find it hard to believe that such a situation would arise, but it is a legal statement that I read.
And I mean, the whole of your talk seems to be saying that we should be more accepting of what happens, and in some situations accepting that it should happen, probably.
I think providing the patient is competent, that's the important thing, and requests it, then it should be very strongly considered, yes.
Yeah. And I was quite struck that you said, and this presumably comes from your experience at the hospice, that for most people, there is a stage of acceptance.
Yes.
And can you tell us more about that? How does that come about? Is that more difficult for some people than others?
Yes, it is. I think that if the patient is at peace mentally and physically, then the acceptance is more readily visible, certainly. I have seen people, though, racked in pain, breathless to the end, and I can't say that was a peaceful.
And less
difficult, less
acceptable.
acceptable.
So there are some people who don't accept it.
There are, yes,
Yeah.
not everybody, but the majority, I feel, do.
Right. And is religious belief
That's an important
affecting
part.
that?
Yes, that is an important part, and this is why I mentioned the convener of your faith, whatever that faith is an important part. And I often noticed, and these young ladies will back that up at the hospice, that people, the various conveners of faith, do visit the patients there, and there is palpable relief after such visits.
Let me see if anyone has any questions. You've got the mic, so you're.
I'm allowed, and I usually start the ball rolling. I read a fantastic book in the last year. It could have done with quite a lot of blue pencil editing because it went on a little bit sometimes, but it was by one of my favorite people, Alice Roberts, and it's called Buried, and it's a discussion of different thoughts about death and different funerary practices that are informed by the archaeology that she's taken part in, which includes some stuff that was done on Anglesey as well. But yeah, so maybe that's another thing that might be added to the bibliography, Buried by Alice Roberts.
Thank you.
So now then, we should wait for the microphone to get to you so that the recording will be intact. Does anyone want to kick off on this? Yeah, get the mic to you. There we are. It's coming. Out of sprint, actually.
Is it working? Yes, as one of your older people here, your talk was very relevant and very interesting to me. I realize that death is inevitable. It's the dying that worries me. And I please don't take this the wrong way, John. But I have always regarded my health as my responsibility. And that's not to say that during my life I haven't been very grateful of interventions when things have happened. And when things have happened and the medical profession have put me right, it's again my responsibility to recover. As I get older, and you can't help confronting the idea of death as you get older, I suddenly realized that this sort of control is gradually ebbing away. And this is what worries me. I worry that I will get to a stage or suffer something where perhaps the treatment is more than I can cope with, and I would rather not have the treatment, but the medical profession are bound to treat me, and I wouldn't be able to.
Gladys, if I can just intercede there, you can refuse treatment.
Can you?
Yes.
And they will take it on board. I know people who have been reluctant to have heart surgery, and the doctor's been on and on and on at them until they've been worn down. And that worries me. And also the fact that I might get to a stage where my family are mopping me down and spooning gruel into me. And really, I don't want to continue any longer. And, you know, I've had a good life. And there comes a time when you are quite prepared to go because it's too much trouble. And this lack of control over your own life is what worries me.
I do appreciate that. I remember when we had a discussion at the AGM, and you pointed out then it wasn't death that scared you, it was the act of dying. And it's a very valid point. Thank you.
Can you, I don't know if you have, across what the rules are, but from your GP experience or your hospice experience, whether what is the reality of people who, just as we've heard, may not want big interventions towards the end of their life, and may want
they can be refused.
How does that happen?
You just literally say, I don't want that treatment, this treatment or the other. That's true, isn't it? So I'm sorry, I'm picking on you.
The three of us work in the primary care treatment room and not in the hospital.
Oh, sorry.
It's absolutely fine. Next door to the hospital.
Next door, yeah.
But we're invited by David because we've seen him in a professional capacity, but we don't work in the hospital. But deal with patients with cancer. Yeah. So thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Yeah.
2 ticks.
John, a few years ago, my mum had a stroke. She was 95. Oh, yep. She was 95 and had a good life. And I had power of attorney for her health and welfare. And I was with her. And I knew what her wishes were, that she didn't want to be kept alive. But my brother and I had quite a struggle in the hospital. This wasn't locally, this was down in Bedfordshire, persuading the doctors that they should, stop treatment. And obviously it's quite an emotional time for everyone concerned.
Of course.
And I felt uncomfortable that I had to sort of advocate on her behalf quite strongly. Really, much more strongly than I thought. And I said, well, I have power of attorney. I know what her wishes are. And the doctor said, but my team and I also have a role to play here. And in fact said, that's not up to you, actually. And I felt that they had a trump card. And only if I could persuade them adequately that now was the time to withdraw life support, would they actually go ahead? And I
Well,
don't have a happy memory of that.
I'm
little
sorry to
struggle
hear that, Phil,
that I
because
had.
actually, with the power of attorney, you do have the right. You knew your mother's wishes.
Yeah,
They should have listened. I'm sorry.
yeah. So I'm thinking about the lady's
Mm.
remarks where we are reassured that you do have the opportunity to, refuse treatment. You don't if you've had a stroke. And,
No, but you have power of attorney.
yeah.
You knew her wishes,
Yeah.
so you could speak for her.
Yes. And then the following few days, when eventually they did I think they withdrew fluids, everything. That was the deal, which surprised me. The care was then only going to be moistening her lips and keeping her airway clear. I thought that process was pretty barbaric as well. She was discharged to a care home. I'm not saying that anyone was uncaring. People were caring. But I sat with her in what felt like a travel lodge room. And we expected that since treatment had been withdrawn, that she would fade rapidly. She was frail. And after a day or so, we just couldn't believe that she was still hanging in there. And she continued in that semi-conscious state for 3 or 4 days. I thought, with no one knowing whether she was actually internally suffering. As you've described, the consciousness may still be there. So I thought that was not a good death. And I'm not reassured. And so
I'm just very sorry to hear you have that memory.
Yes, I contribute to the charity, and I hope that the Baroness in Parliament has some success. And certainly the Dignitas option seems something that we should all keep as a consideration. Sorry, I talked for too long.
Not at all. I mean, it's extremely interesting to hear what you said. And you've discussed it in a very practical way. And I just wonder, since you've obviously thought quite a lot about it, what conclusions did this lead you to as to how this should work?
Well, I'm aware. Yes, I'm aware, of course, that doctors don't have the option to ease people on their way. Although I thought from anecdotal tales of past relatives that did occur
In the past.
Yeah. But obviously with the publicity, with certain doctors helping people too easily on their way, that obviously isn't something that is done now. But certainly I think, not too long ago, I think, from my own anecdotal understanding, doctors were quite helpful with a jab of something to help you go to sleep, make it a little bit easier. And I'm hoping that, I'd like to think that the option to go to the Penrose Hospice would be available to us all, and that a journey by EasyJet to Dignitas in Switzerland was going to be unnecessary. But I'm not confident at the moment.
Yeah.
Yes, I can report a similar situation with my mother. She had a DNR in her will.
You speak up a little. But
Yeah, she had a DNR which was registered and known about, and she had a stroke and she was resuscitated. And then for the next 5 years, she was in a care home, and her life was just awful, and it was very stressful for her relations and so on. And I understand that DNRs have to be renewed at regular intervals and things. And
That's correct.
yeah, many people don't seem to know about that. And I was involved in a project trying to update and simplify national health records. And I'm hugely frustrated about the inadequacies of the digital records held within the National Health Service. And in my opinion, there should be an easy way of checking whether or not there is a DNR for that particular person.
And is there not?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
And what's this business? I'm amazed to hear these need renewing. I was totally unaware of that. So do you know the?
There's a time limit on them, David, but I think that the application of an app that's going to be available for you to access your own records, that's been delayed a little bit because of pressure of work, so-called, but you will be able to access your medical record. But I don't, you will, obviously won't be able to access anybody else's, but you'll be able to access your own record. And if a DNR is on that, you can check that.
If I can just cut in there, I was involved in a project at Betsy Cadwallader, and we were making medical records available on a roll basis for the pediatrics department. And the idea was that you used a phone which had a locked section, which was run by the system that provided the information. And the idea was that when you logged in as a nurse or a consultant or whatever, you would see the appropriate records, and you could change those records that you had the capability to change. So, for example, a nurse would be able to update the information about blood pressure and temperature and that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, even though this was shown to be highly efficient and reducing the administration by more than 25%, it was not adopted. The idea of role base is that, let's say there's a paramedic out in an ambulance and they come across somebody who's had a heart attack. How do they get the information about that person quickly so they can see if there is a DNR?
Within a minute or so.
Yeah. And the whole idea of that project was to make that available.
And at the moment, that information is simply not available to the paramedics.
Correct.
Thank you.
Who else would like to? Yeah.
I think we can. Hello. I think we can blame Harold Shipman for altering the mindset of doctors who want to interfere too much in these sort of things. But a lot of people in the medical profession don't want to be involved with euthanasia, but I recommend them, if they haven't seen it, to watch the film Death in Oregon, which is a fantastic film, and it's a way of euthanasia where the doctor has a minimal input. He makes one visit, writes a prescription, and the rest is left to a charity organization to become involved in.
What was the name of that film? I didn't quite...
Death in Oregon.
Death in Oregon. Yeah. There's another comment there. Just behind you.
Yeah, my difficulty is I had what I perceived maybe a kinder end of life for my Jack Russell than I did for my mother. And for some reason, I will never get my head around that. I think we need to be kinder with people at end of life and need to accept it and help people on their way.
Yeah.
2 years ago, I was given a book by a friend. It was called Extra Time by Camilla Cavendish, who I gather was an advisor right at the heart of the David Cameron days. And she promises or warns that living to 120 or 130 will be a fairly commonplace event in people's lives. And it's billions of dollars are being invested in keeping people alive to that length. And that's why the DNR system has to be robust, because we're dealing with multi-billion-dollar companies all dedicated to extending life to a degree which may have terrible effects on the youth. I can't think of anything a more dysfunctional and horrific set of circumstances that surround the corner.
Yes, the microphone is just coming through. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
I do support euthanasia, but if the laws are ever made allowing it, no doubt they will be very tightly bound up in all sorts of ways, so that they can't be used criminally. The problem is we have the example of abortion before us. When abortion was first made legal, it was very tightly bound about with all sorts of rules and regulations. Today it's available on demand. I don't know, is that where we're likely to go?
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to respond to any of these comments? I mean, a lot of the concern seems to be about this DNR issue and the fact that people can express their wishes actually quite clearly, and it doesn't happen. I mean, it does seem incredibly shocking, really, that would happen. But I can see why, if paramedics turn up, they have to act very, very quickly. So what's your experience of that?
With that circumstance, they act on impulse.
Yeah.
Then they're not aware of a DNR, it being in place, so their job is to resuscitate and help as best they can. But if they were aware of a DNR in place, then they'd be wrong to do that.
Yeah.
I'd just like to mention the fact that the past speaker thinks that the improvement in the availability of abortion is a bad thing. I think totally contrary. It's up to the individual person. It's not a bad thing at all. It's a big improvement.
Okay, any more contributions?
Gentlemen.
Yeah.
Hello, John. Sorry, I've lost my voice a bit. I don't know if you recognise me. I just recognised you. I didn't even realise it was you giving the talk. I was a fellow toiler in the world of general practice for
you were
a long
indeed
time, and we
good
worked
evening
together many times. So I very interesting your insights. It's interesting how the debate has focused in a way on it's almost like angels dancing on the head of a pin about DNR, which is a very specific situation. It was actually in my professional career, I don't know about yours, John, you've done a lot more in hospice work. I worked in community palliative care before it was even a specialty in 1979, before I became a GP. And it was never an issue. It becomes an issue when you've got, situations like you called out to a heart attack or something. I agree with you, Owen. You've got to act on, what's there. Sort of the opposite of shoot first, ask questions. I resuscitate first and ask questions afterwards. But it's difficult. My mother had she didn't actually have a DNR, but she had an advanced directive in a living will. Then one night she was in a care home. One night she woke up breathless, pulled the bell. Nurses came. She was breathless. 999 off to hospital. I don't want to go to hospital. Oh, but you're not well, So she didn't really have much say in it, and it's always situation specific. And I think I don't think there's any situation where you can always be watertight. But going back to the earlier comment about having choice over whether or not you accept medical treatment or not, I think those are quite clear cut. do you want to have this heart transplant or this bypass or this cancer treatment or not? Because you can actually discuss with somebody the pros and cons, and I think you can make an informed decision. Might not be the right decision. Which brings on to the other point that we talked about, is capacity. So, you said you had lasting power of attorney. I think if the person you had lasting power of attorney for has capacity themselves, their choice still carries. If they don't have capacity, then fine. Well, then you're it.
But basically, you're saying you can't anticipate all the situations, so it's difficult.
You can't. No, I am saying that.
Yeah.
And just another book that I'd add to the bibliography is Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. He was actually an American surgeon. I think American palliative care is decades behind the UK system, but he's basically advocating good palliative care. But yes, be informed, know what give the choice. Not all treatment is good. And the other one is a book I can't say I've read, but I've got it on my shelf by Henry Marsh, who is another surgeon, who is an excellent writer, who's just recently been diagnosed with prostate cancer, I think, and is contemplating his own mortality. And maybe over the Christmas holidays I'll get around to reading it.
Thank you.
There's one just here.
Yeah. Be there in 2 ticks.
If I could just share.
Just why don't you go there first? Just because I think it's a response to that, and then we'll come to you.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Just we need the mic though, because then it's on the recording. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, the issue about the renewal of DNRs.
Yes.
I heard that on Radio 4 a year or so ago, and there was a solicitor who said she'd tattooed the DNR on her arm.
Wow.
And then she found out that was not viable because it had to be renewed.
She did new tattoo. How often does it have to be renewed? You know.
I don't know how frequently skin cells replace themselves, but
does anybody know how long the period of renewal is?
I think it's yearly.
Annually.
That's right. Am I correct in saying that? Yeah.
Annually.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just staying with the topic of DNRs, and my experience, which was thrown to the pot, was my mother with dementia in her 90s, having broken her pelvis in hospital with a DNR on her notes, and a nurse, I don't know if it was a trainee or a junior, my mother had a cardiac arrest, and the nurse summoned a crash team who resuscitated her. They just didn't look at what was on the notes, and she lived another 3 unnecessary years with dementia.
Yeah.
So my motto is to make the DNR tattooing sounded a good idea until I needed it renewing, but it needs to be in very big letters, and whoever you're talking to needs to be aware that it's in place.
Because that's at the end of the bed. I have experience going to someone's home where it's in the porch. Isn't there a system for that? Where you can leave documents.
I think it was in the notes rather than at the end of the bed. But the crash team thought they'd done a good job, and they had.
They had.
Yeah. Any other comments or contributions or questions? Yeah, just to come back to you. Yeah. There we are. That's it.
It's not quite as good as the question.
Yeah, so the system that we developed actually had traffic lights on the phone system. So when you were logged in as a nurse or consultant or whatever, there would be traffic lights depending on the current situation for that particular person. So it would have been very simple to have had a DNR flag on the screen for that particular individual.
Immediately come up.
Yeah.
Just as people are thinking about what else they want to to ask or say. I was quite struck by your comments about people, which I think probably virtually everyone does, pressing the fear of death or postponing and thinking about it, or trying to avoid dealing with it. I mean, in your experience, is that a damaging attitude, or I mean, it's obviously a very normal attitude, but
I think it's normal. It's the denial of death is a sort of self-preservation thing. It's not a topic though that I'm used to discussing with patients. How do you feel about death? Well,
you don't ask that question.
You don't. I know. I don't. I don't.
They might wonder about your practice.
They might indeed. Perhaps I should have done.
So, since I've got the microphone, I wonder whether some of this debate that we've been having about the DNRs and so on and so forth is pushed in the behaviour associated with DNRs that we've heard about is potentially pushed in that direction by a more litigious environment now, where perhaps medical staff feel that it's better to be, I was going to say on the side of angels, but that's the other way around, isn't it, really? But it's sort of, you're probably better to try and keep somebody alive than not, from a sort of a legal perspective.
I just wonder if anyone, I mean, they may not want to discuss it, even if they have, but is anyone aware of any case where a DNR has worked actually, and that it's been taken notice of, and the wishes of the patient have been respected?
This is a little family story. In the late 60s, early 70s, my mother was called to say, your father's in hospital. He's had a heart attack. He's in a very poor way. And she came over from overseas to Sutton Coldfield, and she found her father, who was in his 80s, in a bed, unconscious, presumably sedated. And he was just covered in pipes and things stuck up his nose and here, there, and everywhere on him. And my mother said, what are you doing this for? And he was a grumpy old man anyway, so not quite good enough reason. But no, you got to think about these things. My grandmother had already died. He had no wish to live on his own in the house. He certainly wouldn't have wanted to be in a care home or everything. And my mother said, please take them all out and leave them to go peacefully. And they did. So there was no DNR per se in those days, as far as I'm aware. Right. But he, melted away peacefully. And then my mother, and again, I don't know about DNRs then. My mother died at the end of the last century in Stanley Hospital, as it happens. She had contracted polio not long after I was born, but that has nothing to do with me, obviously. She slowly but surely was losing her ability to walk properly. And I remember seeing her having to move her hips to get the bone back in because she was wasting away. And she wrote then a living will, and the living will basically said, do not resuscitate. Now, fortunately, she never had to use that because she did die peacefully after a fall and so on and so forth. But I suspect that, because I didn't know anything about what's it called, when you get the power of attorney, I don't remember knowing about power of attorney, so I didn't have it. But she went peacefully. But I suspect that had it come to a choice with the doctors or the staff, I think they would have allowed her to go rather than keep her alive because she did not want that.
That's all quite a long time ago.
Well, we're going back now to the end of the last century, yeah. Yeah, 22 years ago.
Yep. You just wait for the microphone to rush round.
Oh, God. Informed by walking football.
There we are.
I think I was in a lucky situation with my mother in that she had her throat checked out and they realised that she had a secondary cancer. And initially the surgeon who found it went straight away and said, right, we can operate, we can do chemo, we can do radiotherapy. And we just looked at him and said, she's got severe dementia, she's going to forget what you told her in 5 minutes. She really hates having the camera put down her throat. Is that actually really necessary? And he straight away just changed track and basically we did nothing and had palliative care. So I think some people are human and they will listen. But obviously his initial reaction was, my job is to keep this lady alive. But obviously he didn't know the circumstances of her. But as soon as he realised the circumstances, he just completely changed track. I said, okay, we'll perhaps put a stent in her throat just to keep her more comfortable. But I think it's just giving that opportunity, giving the information at the right time to the correct person responsible for either keeping the person alive or not.
What year was that?
This is this year. Yeah.
Recently.
This is January 22.
There's one at the back there, yeah.
I just got a slight warning about DNRs. I've got a DNR, which obviously is useless now because it's over a year old. But I have been fairly specific in my treatment of it. So if I drop down now and it was in date, I certainly wouldn't want you not to resuscitate me. So it's a whole different ball game if I've got terminal cancer or something like that. So I think you've got to, when you're doing a DNR, be a little bit specific about when you want it to work.
Yes, this is your point, that it's so hard to anticipate the situation. Yeah,
it's got to be situation specific.
Almost like it's almost like you need to give principles to guide people.
Yeah, and it's just to repeat for the record, it's got to be situation specific.
Yeah.
And the other comment about that you were saying, I mean, perhaps John would disagree. I would like to think that our job is not to cure the patient at all costs, but to do what is in the best interest of the patient.
I totally agree.
And that, again, if somebody, I had a brother with Down syndrome, so he never had capacity. So I could never have power of attorney because you have to have capacity to allow someone to have power of attorney. So when he was ill, and decisions were made about his end-of-life care, he had complications of gallbladder trouble, it wasn't cancer. It was a best interests meeting, what was in the best interests of my brother. I was involved, the medical staff, nursing staff were involved, and we all came to a sensible conclusion that no further treatment was appropriate. But I think that's, it's, and if the patient has got capacity, they are front and central to the decision-making process. And I think, sadly, it is still lacking in modern medicine, in across the world and here in the UK.
Can I ask you to reflect just a little more on what you said about death not necessarily being an event, but more of a process? Because that can't always be the case, obviously, but you're saying that...
What was only found out this year, that when the heart stops, the brain doesn't automatically stop. So when do you actually say Joe Bloggs is dead? When do you say that? It's a moot point. There's no finite time. I suppose when everything stops, that is death. And that's why I made the definition that death is an irreversible process. So if someone collapses and is resuscitated, they're not dead by definition.
We get the mic. But just to be clear, just as the mic comes down, presumably people may not be aware of brain activity.
They may not be, no.
Yeah.
I think this was only found out in February of this year.
Right.
Thank you. I've heard about brain stem death rather than cardiac arrest. Could you describe?
Well, brain stem death is where the blood supply to a part of the brain, an important part of the brain where all the essential centers are that organize things like blood pressure and heart rate. If that dies, if that part of the tissue is restricted to oxygen supply and dies, you are dead.
You are dead. So that's definitive.
Yes, that would be.
Have you noticed all the horror stories this evening?
Yes.
Have been about.
Could you just say that so everyone can hear you?
Have you noticed all the horror stories have been about elderly mothers? This is very worrying.
No, I heard about somebody's brother.
Is that because you've seen them off before?
Any more thoughts on this tricky issue? Have you got anything you want to?
No, I'm just upset at what I've heard about adverse comments about medical profession sitting here, but they're all justifiable.
It's so important as well.
Absolutely.
It's not a small matter. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Forgot what I was going to say. It took so long to get this. What I was thinking was that we're being very pragmatic, and death isn't. When you have a relative who's dying, you're not being very. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
You're not being very pragmatic. You're emotional.
Right.
And so your responses might be quite different to us sitting in this room discussing it now. As I would say to my boys, my children, I don't want to linger forever. I don't want to have a painful death. I'd rather walk into the sea and disappear. But that's me now. What am I going to be like in 10, 15, 20 years' time? I may be quite different. So it just doesn't feel quite real, the discussions that we're having perhaps tonight. I know we've all had experiences of death. I've been with various people as they've died, and I've always found it quite comforting that they've been able to go and leave their lives behind. But
you're saying that not only you may change your attitudes anyway, an individual can change their mind about what they want, but also those around them could not want to respect their wishes in the emotion of a moment. And
absolutely.
That raises issues. Yeah. Okay, I sense that we're reaching towards the end of this. If just a last chance, if anyone wants to, yeah.
I think I'd like to give credit to obviously the work that's put into palliative care, because I think when people are definitely on the way out, there's lots of people there that making sure it is very comfortable, that it is peaceful and they're not in pain. And I think the palliative care that's provided for people is excellent. And I think that should take away a lot of people's fear of dying, because if palliative care is put in place, that there is painkillers provided, there is anti-agitation drugs given, so that they are given the opportunity to die with hopefully as little pain as possible and with a degree of dignity too. So I think lots of credit should go to the places like St David's, who provide that lovely, peaceful way of departing without the pain, and therefore hopefully we shouldn't be fearing death, knowing that there is an institution there that's going to help us on the way in a more peaceful manner.
Thank you.
Okay, well, on that very positive thought, thank you. And thank you for everyone's contributions, but particularly to Dr. John Lewis for leading us in this discussion. So you did it in a very thoughtful and, as I say, sensitive way. So we're very grateful to you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure when the food is.
So I'll go and find out and
Okay.
report back quickly.
Any minute there's food. Yeah.
The bar is open at the moment, so if you need to replenish.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Honestly.
You're allowed to mute now,
Yes,
guys.
just about to go red. How are you? What are you doing with yourself at the moment?